Let's begin our last discussion of Book 4, Bill, by addressing something that often bothers Christians. I'm sure it's bothered you before, like it's bothered me, the suffering of the righteous. And it probably bothers us more when we hear of someone else suffering, when we're the ones suffering unjustly.
Yeah,
That's when we're
yeah,
really bothered.
indeed.
So in chapter 6, Boethius has agreed with philosophy. Yes, evil people should be pitied, like we talked about in our last discussion. But why are good people so often oppressed and wicked people rewarded? If God is in charge of all things, how can that be? Boethius is confused and amazed by that. And he wonders, if God so often treats people the opposite of what they deserve, how is that any different than if random chance were governing the universe? And philosophy says, actually, everything, quote, everything happens as it should because a good ruler governs the world. And so Boethius says, please explain. And she says, okay, well, it's a pretty big topic. All I'll need to address is God's providence, the order of events in their chain of causes, chance, God's knowledge, predestination, the freedom of the will. That's all.
No problem.
No problem. We'll get more into that when we discuss a couple of chapters from Book 5. But philosophy's answer that she begins here in chapter 6 hinges on the relationship between and the distinction between God's providence and what she calls fate. Now, if you've read systematic theology, I know you read various systematic theology volumes, they don't really talk about fate.
Yeah.
So in Reformed theology, what philosophy calls providence, Reformed theology calls his decrees.
Right.
And what she calls fate, Reformed theology calls providence.
Providence, right.
So from our position in the world, as we're stuck in time, experiencing everything God has decreed, we see things happen that seem strange. Some are good, some are bad from our perspective. But philosophy says, whatever the case, everything that's happening is coming directly from God's unalterable decrees, his plan in advance. Now, how biblical is that idea, Bill?
Yeah. Well, I think as starting points are really important, like the foundations here, because even to use the terminology God's decrees, which of course is a very important and terminology to use, but it can sound cold. It can sound sterile, and I think this is why we can never isolate the conversation of God's decrees from God's providence, from all the other attributes of God, right? We don't want to, we're talking about the simplicity of God and all of those sorts of things. So God is, yes, the decrees are a vital part of how God rules in his universe, but they're folded together with all of his other attributes. So I think that's a really important point. So that there's an intelligence, there is a love, there's a plan, and so when we're looking at why do evil people thrive? Why are they rich and some obviously, and they seem impervious to any notion of suffering? Well, we look at that because our metric is very different from the divine mind and intelligence, and we look at that as, wow, in a sense that we would like that. We're drawn to that. We're shall we use the word tempted toward that. But in God's mind, those are the very things that could be evidence of God's displeasure. That these are the things that are causing a person's soul to shrivel. These are the things that people are very small-minded, that are materialistic, right? Their minds are focused on the here and the now. So I think in terms of how God gets his will accomplished, that he can judge people by granting them what looks to us as a great deal of material possessions. Conversely, I think for the believer, what looks like deprivation
Mm-hmm.
and trial, we know that these are things that God uses in our lives not to harm us or to hinder us, but to actually purify us. So it's
Mm-hmm.
just the exact opposite. It just shows how the metrics are so different. And I think when you're looking at decrees, when you're looking at providence, those are the sorts of things that help us make sense. And so, yeah, again, borrowing from the last discussion, we should, in a sense, pity those who are able to go out and indulge in such materialism without a sense of sacrifice, stewardship,
Mm.
generosity, anything of that nature. That a person like that's to be
Mm.
pitied, it
I,
seems to me.
I like how you said, like, we know what God is doing.
Yeah.
So we're not just, and of course, philosophy is going to, she talks about these things, how what seems like good fortune can be bad and what seems like bad can be
Right.
good. Um, but it's what we know that is helping us. And she has already talked about this. She talks about this multiple times, especially in the songs, when she talks about how it's love that moves the world,
Yeah.
that turns the spheres. It's the love of God that rules on high. So when she talks about the knowledge of God, she's talking about a God of love.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important for us. So I want to hold the truths. So say in one hand, Psalm 115 that says, "Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases."
Yeah.
That's absolutely true, but it's not. That's in the context of the Psalms that talks about the covenant love of God, and so
Mm-hmm.
the God who is decreeing every single event that happens, so that no atom acts out of place, is the God who has predestined events like our salvation, so that we who were the first to hope in Christ might be to the praise of his glory. Ephesians 1.
Yeah.
Sealing us with his Spirit, giving us the guarantee of our inheritance, making promises like Romans 8. For those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, all things work together for good. So we hold that with the other hand, the absolute sovereignty of God and his complete control over all things, and his love for us. We need both.
Well, and I think even in light of your discussion there in Romans 8, if you go previous in the chapter there, Paul says in verse 18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this
Mm,
present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." And I think that's a really significant point. Again, as he goes down through this in chapter 8, for we know that the whole creation
mm,
has been groaning together, and it's awaiting redemption. Also, he talks about where is that? Where it talks about where suffering were considered as um, those who, oh, I can't remember now, those who are sacrificed, those who are
mm.
brought to the slaughter.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I,
near the
I
end of the
can't find
chapter,
that.
counted
Yeah,
as sheep for the slaughter.
yeah,
But we're
sorry.
we're more than conquerors through him who loves
Exactly. Yeah,
us.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. So before and after, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. This whole chapter that is enmeshed. It's sort of couched. It couches that phrase, "For we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose," and saying, "Who shall separate us
Mm,
from the love of God which is in
mm,
Christ Jesus? Shall distress and persecution, famine, nakedness,
mm.
danger, sword, all those sorts of
So we need to
things."
hold on to these things that we know. This is bringing us back really to book one, with instead of
Right.
wallowing in emotions, we remember the complete sovereignty of God, his good
Exactly.
governance of the world, and his goodness. As
Yeah.
philosophy says in chapter 6, she says, here's the situation: God, who knows, acts, and people who are ignorant marvel.
Exactly. Yeah.
we're marveling. What in the world is going on? Well, we can trust God, who knows, is acting. We can still rejoice in our ignorance through faith. We can count it all joy when we meet trials of various kinds because of what we know that God has revealed about his character.
I think that's right. And I'm looking at a quote here from the Consolation. Now the health of the soul is nothing but righteousness, and vice is its sickness. Right? I think that's the point here, that our goals, our aspirations are shaped by who God is, what God's plan is for his creation. When we're outside of that, i.e. vice, then that really is sickness to our soul, as Boethius says. It's not good. It's going to end in disaster for us. So.
And God is determined to work things for our good. So
yeah.
Even if they're bad, God is curing sickness in us. God
exactly.
is doing good things for us, and we receive this through faith.